Hello, and welcome to Shatter Our Souls with Nobari. Today, we are tackling the second last video of the Metroid Monday series, at least until Prime 4 arrives. And what better way to finish it off than by finishing off the last three regions prior to Fate. Now, as far as Brio goes, there are two upgrades that I can think of off the top of my head here that need to be sorted out. The first is at the top of a half-pipe ramp, and the other is part of what is arguably one of the longest chain of events to get an upgrade in possibly the entire trilogy. Necessitating the player to have affected the overall environment in not just one, but two major regions in the world, link them together, get the ship to transport a large piece of cargo from one end of the world to the other, and all while being forced effectively to traverse between them on foot. This makes this particular set of situations some of the longest running in the entire franchise, and probably one of the weirdest overall, if I'm being completely honest. But today, instead of focusing in on the upgrades, I instead want to focus in on what was effectively the roots of the Metroid franchise. Now, this might sound kind of weird when I say that Metroid had begun its situation or its storyline as a kind of a copy paste of sorts of the Alien franchise of movies. Think 80s action movie type situation with what they were called in that world were the Xenomorphs. The Xenomorphs were incredibly adept hunters, far more potent than most of what the world at that time was capable of handling, save for our protagonist. A female and protagonist locked on a derelict spaceship with but one of these xenomorphs aboard. And effectively, as the Alien franchise progressed, so too did the Metroid franchise. This idea of the two being interlinked and the ideas for what made the Metroid unique, powerful, were often ripped almost directly from the Alien franchise itself, to the point that the Alien's multi-phase evolution had been almost directly ripped off by Metroid in and of itself to allow for the Metroid species multi-stage evolution, which I think is a pretty cool little tidbit. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is because when you dig into Metroid Prime 3, there are a few major things that kind of tie back to the roots of the Alien franchise of movies. And one of them is actually the title card of this particular video, and that is that it's relating directly to the Gfs Valhalla. Now, the Valhalla shows up at the kind of midpoint of the game as a derelict space shuttle. The point of the Valhalla is to effectively hold information for Samus to gain access to the final location of the entire game phase. The information has to be gained from an alternative source, specifically a space pirate vessel left behind, docked in some capacity to the Gfs Valhalla. Now, why I want to bring this up is because A, this is just how the game goes, and B, because it actually does a lot of storytelling not through the traditional means of giving you logbooks and lore, but instead through subtext and visual storytelling. Now, If you remember, back to the very first episode of this series, and rather the opening of Metroid Prime 3 as a whole, you will know that the Space Pirates attempted a takeover event of the Gfs Valhalla. Now the Olympus, my apologies. The idea behind this, shall we say, hostile takeover was to get the attention of the Federation away from what Dark Samus was planning to do to Noria. How? I have no idea. But during this segment, you are met with several issues, including enemy docking or boarding ships coming in and attacking the Olympus, smashing out windows, doing all sorts of damage. It was perhaps unclear in the moment, but these space pirates have done this before. Not with a hunter as versatile and powerful as Samus, but they have done it. And I want to make that point kind of adamantly clear in this exact moment, because what you see with the Valhalla is what would have happened to the Olympus had Samus and the other hunters not been there. See, the damage, destruction, the bioweapons that were released aboard the Valhalla all had roots to the space pirates and their actions aboard the Valhalla. The GFS Olympus just also happened to have had 4 separate hunters, each with a very, very potent skill set to battle against a standard pirate invasion. This invasion, however, was meant to be anything but. The idea of this invasion of the Olympus was meant to shut down and kind of separate the Federation from what the entire area of, or separate them from Norian. Because if the Federation was separated from the planet Norian, technically, there really wouldn't be much left for the Federation to fight for or to charge into battle with. It was, for lack of better terminology, their base of operations in any intergalactic combative scenario. Now, because of this, shutting down... How do I want to word this? There are several things that happened in a very specific timeline in order to make everything work. The first was the battle against the GFS Valhalla. Now, the Valhalla was the result of the space pirates desiring to capture and collect a Aurora unit from the Federation to be able to offer to Dark Samus as a gift. This pleased Dark Samus greatly, and the idea behind it, what Dark Samus had in mind for this, was to use a Aurora unit to implant a virus on the rest of the Aurora units in the Federation, shall we say Federation space in general. This was their inherent initial goal. But, as you see later down the line, it had some far-reaching consequences, shutting down access to their fuel stores on Brio, and shutting down access to their intergalactic satellite network on Elysium. Cool. It also shut down the interplanetary defense system around Nori. This was part one. Once the Aurora units had become disconnected from one another, it became very clear that there was in fact a way around getting through the Federation's defenses. At this point, each planet had been designated a seed. One for Elysia, one for Brio, and one more for none other than Norian. Lastly, there was the Battle of the Gfs Valhalla and the Battle of Norian, which was intended primarily to act as a battle over the conquest of the galaxy. If Norian fell, there would be absolutely nothing that the Federation could do to be able to combat against Dark Samus, because their entire defensive system would be effectively demolished. It was only by, dare I say, luck and happenstance that the Four Hunters had been there and stopped the initial threat of the Battle of Norian. Because Norian didn't go the way that Dark Samus had wanted, we end up with the events of Prime 3, where Plan B had to be enacted. Now, I like this idea that the Hunters being taken over and defeated by Dark Samus at the end of the Norian battle was Plan B. In my mind, Dark Samus had no interest in the Hunters initially, but seeing how each of them had found a unique way to thwart her plans, Dark Samus instead opted to turn each of the Hunters into commanders within the army. One to control Briar, one to control Elysia, and one to act as a general on none other than the pirate home. All three of these are incredibly important, and each of the three Hunters did their job beautifully. However, one by one, each of the Hunters had fallen to none other than Samus herself. Anyways, so that is more or less how everything came to be in the situation that Samus was in at the beginning of the game. The rest is documented rather heavily throughout this particular series of videos. But, as you've seen, I am jumping from planet to planet, aiming on completing the item inventory. Now, I figure, as the final game in the trilogy, hoofty woofty, words are hard today. As the final game in the trilogy, Prime 3 has the special effect, the special honor of being the only one to have 100% completion, at least as far as item collection is concerned, done and settled, done and dusted before the end of the game. And thus today, we will be collecting the final items as well as the codes to access phase. Welcome, finally, to the Gfs Valhalla, a land of the dead, warriors who have fought and fallen aboard this now derelict space station. There is a lot of symbolism behind that one. Valhalla, within Olympian-style lore, correction, not Olympian style, Valhalla is the great hall in which the warriors of the past have fallen and joined none other than Odin himself at the table. And here's something that I love about the mentality of Valhalla. Any warrior who dies in battle is welcome to Valhalla, to a land of peace and plenty. This is the role of Valhalla. But, unfortunately, the Gfs Valhalla here did not get the memo. And we are in fact in a realm of dire despair and much loss. And so, we, as a warrior of sorts, must, of course, fight through the GFS Valhalla as we do literally every other location in this galaxy, and aim to answer the easy question. Can Samus beat Metroid Prime 3 on Hyper Mode? The answer is very, very clearly absolutely she can. But there are things within Hyper Mode that have raised some questions for me over the course of the last, well, if I'm being honest, over the last year. Initially, I had assumed when playing the Metroid franchise that Samus was just absurdly powerful. That as a character, Samus's whole ideology was that she was the biggest, baddest entity in the entire Galactic Federation and associated others. I had believed that Samus was to be the most notorious hunter for a reason. That she could and would rip through virtually anything if need be in order to bring about galactic peace. This is, I think, a sentiment that a lot of us as gamers have echoed. But the thing is that when I was playing the more traditional Metroid games, one after another a few years ago, initially, the first one that I played, which was Zero Mission, I felt incredibly empowered. I felt like I was unstoppable for the duration of the game. That when I gained the final power-up and went ripping through the space pirate mothership, that there was nothing in the galaxy that could stop. There was no means, no way, no how that anything could stop my progression forward. I want to make this abundantly clear. And after beating Zero Mission a few times, I opted to beat the next game in the series, which was the original Metroid 2. And it wasn't hard by any means, but it was one that I spent a lot of time focusing on collecting everything. That my goal was never to be just a one-off in and out battle. It was meant to be that I would get through everything one section at a time, the entire game, and truly show that Samus was as powerful as I had always deemed the character. And then came Super Metroid. And I'll be honest, this is where my faith in Samus's raw power began to waver. There was something in Super Metroid that Zero Mission didn't have. Zero Mission mimics the snappy combat movement of Metroid Fusion. Much more fast-paced, much more linear adventure ensued. And I found it very interesting that Super Metroid, I always felt like I was lagging behind. Like I was the one who was ill-equipped for said adventure. That the job that I was going for would inevitably come back to haunt me. And by the time I got to, I guess it would have been fighting Kraid for the, what now at that point, probably 5th time, if we're counting Zero Mission, that I really started to get a sense of what I was up against. That Samus, despite her almost untouchable status within video game history, seemed human. It wasn't a level of human that I had become familiar with when I talk about video games. I'm talking about a level of human that felt she was a protector, but her weaknesses did not define her. She pursues strength for the betterment of all. But there were a moment where her being human and being treated as such came to a head with the character that I had in my mind. See, the idea that Samus was not this unstoppable battle machine, that Samus could be seen as average, that her capabilities were anything but extraordinary, crossed my mind, if only just. This was not something that just any person could do, surely. And yet, Samus is struggling. This character that I have propped on a pedestal for years was struggling. It must just be me, right? The floaty controls. There's something in this that got to me. And in Super Metroid, I ended up finishing the game. But even I felt fear battling against Mother Brain. I felt fear, trepidation, and most of all, concern. Because I knew what was coming next. I heard all about the very genre-defining but oddly unique game trilogy in the series. That being Metroid Fusion. The fear of the unknown had gripped me at this point, and I pressed on, knowing that I had to beat every Metroid game before Metroid Dread came out. And somehow, someway, the term Dread never crossed my mind as, maybe there's something to do with this being a little bit more scary, or that this character doesn't have as much power as I might have initially thought. No, that can't be. And so, I continued on. I beat back the SAX. I fought back against the entire enemy platoons and fleets across the entire city. And I made it to the end, where I fought a Omega Metroid in Metroid Fusion. And it felt weird. This is an enemy that I've fought before in Metroid 2. Surely Samus can't be this much weaker in Fusion than in Metroid 2. That would make no sense. That would mean that Samus has gone so far backward in strength that it would be nigh unstoppable. And that this once nigh unstoppable being, capable of dismantling entire planetary operations on her own, was now weak. At least by comparison to a character she once was. And then it hit me like a truck. Metroid Dread. Now this game felt very snappy, very far removed from Super Metroid controls. I played it knowing full well that anywhere I went, I would be capable of beating what came ahead. Surely, this is another Metroid Zero mission situation, right? Oh, the Emmys are a lot more powerful than I thought. Oh this, oh that. Every time I played Metroid Dread, I always felt concerned. I mean, Samus is still as powerful as she has ever been. It's not her that's wavering, it's me who's lacking. Where my mindset always went. But my opinion of the character has shifted greatly, as I'm sure you've noticed throughout the course of this potentially long-winded segment. Metroid as a whole was never about the triumphant, or was rarely about the triumphant, I should say. Don't get me wrong, Metroid Prime and the two games that feel the most triumphant, the most energetic, the most powerful are Metroid Prime and Metroid Zero Mission. The two games where Samus is effectively considered at her peak, at her most dangerous. She has already become the most powerful bounty hunter in the galaxy, and this proves it. But Metroid Dread has shown, well, rather the entirety of the Metroid franchise has shown that while she may be considered the most powerful bounty hunter, there are still many areas that Samus is perhaps ill-equipped. Now, why I want to get at this, why I want to mention this as even being remotely a problem, is that The Metroid Prime trilogy, when playing through them on normal mode, for example, which the average player will, they're going to feel powerful. They're going to feel obscenely strong. They're going to feel unstoppable. Even in the most dire of circumstances, the game itself is handing itself. But on hyper mode, that's where the real challenge begins. What enemies were once just minor footnotes, perhaps a little beefy or, dare I say, damage spongy, become unequivocal monsters in the wrong hands. And I love that about hyper mode. See, I think that certain games, the challenge is not the objective. It is a side effect. Sometimes the challenge is the point. And I think that part of my prior experience with this game, with this franchise, was that the game itself was meant to be easy. That it was a one-off power trip. You, the player, were meant to feel strong, untouchable, unbeatable. In virtually every circumstance the game threw at you, you were meant to feel empowered. Hyper mode, however, recontextualizes the entire trilogy in a way that I never thought possible. See, Prime 1, I died 6 times. Mostly to Ridley, actually. Once to a lava pit because I was being, silly. Once or twice to the Phazon infused Omega Pirate. That was pretty much it. The entire game bent backwards because I had played it so many times. I understood the patterns, I've beaten the bosses, I knew what I was getting into, right from the word go. Prime 2, however, I think I've mentioned it. There were a couple bosses that absolutely wrecked me. Notably, in Torvus Bog was my first batch of deaths. Specifically, I died to the Boost Ball Guardian. And this guy was an absolute menace. Near impossible to beat under ordinary circumstances. Oh well, I thought. 14 deaths later, and I realized that there might be something more. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just struggling with this particular boss, or it was poorly designed. So I pressed on. And I fought more bosses, one after another. I failed to Quadraxis about 3-4 separate times and thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I knew this was going to be a tough boss. I knew that I didn't have much for healing, so it's no big deal. And then came the Emperor. Emperor Ing showed me exactly what I was getting into. See, Prime 2, for all intents and purposes, is the hardest game in the trilogy. But it is the hardest game in the trilogy because I, the player, hadn't spent the time to properly get to know it. I, as a player, am not as skilled nor as powerful as Samus the character is. But the odds are never stacked as far in the player's favor as I would like. This is a dangerous universe where the average human, the average soldier, will be woefully underprepared to go into combat against the world's most notorious and powerful enemies. This, of course, brings me to why I wanted to talk about this. Because, ultimately, I had assumed that playing the Prime Trilogy on Hyper Mode would be a fun little distraction. I was getting excited for Prime 4. beating it on Hyperbole and actually taking the time to go through every game.
Acquired appears to be a Space Pirate Leviathan command code. It is likely that this code could allow us to control the Leviathan in orbit above the pirate home world. Find a way onto the Leviathan and use that code.
Thank you, 217. Anyways, the point I'm getting at is that having gone through the entire trilogy, Samus is and will forever be the most powerful entity in her universe. I don't believe that's something that very many can disagree with, especially after the events of Metroid Dread. However, there is a but in it. We, the player, are not exactly as capable as Samus. And I believe there's a certain level of Samus is not as powerful as many of us players have propped the character up to be. Don't get me wrong, incredibly powerful, incredibly capable, incredibly over the top, but still human. Or about, I don't know, 25% human at this point. She's got Metroid, she's got her human DNA, she's got the Chozo DNA. Yeah, okay, fair. So she's like 30% human. But even at 30% human, there are so many things that I personally believe could have been challenges for her that just aren't. There are some that might say that she is simply propped up by her suit. And that's maybe true. But I argue that there is not a single entity in the entirety of the Metroid universe capable of utilizing the power suit with half of the efficiency. Even Raven Beast, one of the foremost Chozo warriors, was unable to best his protege and, dare I say, quote-unquote, daughter in combat using the technology that he had spent his entire life harnessing and using. Therefore, I truly, truly believe that if the franchise were to continue farther, there would have to be something truly horrifying, terrifying, and potentially world-ending at its core, that it would be near impossible for any player to truly be able to see and experience what actually comes out. Anyway, if you like what you see, if you want to see the finale of Metroid Mondays, drop a like, leave a subscribe, be good to one another, and I hope you all have a good one. Until next week, see you next time.